I know we're live, I know. Welcome everyone to the Row House Forum, to this live event. Let's clap our hands so people can hear. It's almost as good as the real thing, isn't it? Welcome to the Row House Forum. I'm Tom Becker, and I know that we had the camera on live because you guys who are watching at home have a feel for what the Row House Forum is. And so that's why we did that. And I'm coming through loud and clear, sounds like. That's good. We're really glad you guys joined us in our inaugural forum here at the Trust in Lancaster City. We're going to take your questions live. We're going to go back and forth between the live questions and the folks coming in online. So that'll be fun, interesting. So this is our first time doing such a live stream, and I'm really grateful to Cursive Films. Michael Rothermel and Saritha are here, and they're running the live stream, and they have great equipment, so we're grateful for that. But we're glad you're here. And again, if you're watching at home, if you RSVP'd, thank you for that. And thank you so much for letting us know you're here. As far as masks go, I think I've mentioned that most people who are here tonight, we are concerned about that. This is a forum about a pandemic, which is ironic, right? Yeah, when you're walking through the building, we'd ask you to wear them. And if you're comfortable taking it off when you're sitting, we're spread out. Use your common sense. We're comfortable with that, as long as we're careful. I want to tell you a little bit about upcoming events, and these will be live streamed. We're going to plan on doing this throughout the whole year, from September all the way through May, 6 forums. And our next one is October 16th, and I think generally they land on third Fridays. Steve Groff is coming, and he's a crop cover farmer living in southern part of the county, and really in that crop cover field of growing crops that cover other crops, and sort of organic farming, hybrid farming like that. He's kind of a rock star, and he wrote a book recently about the future-proof farm, and he's excited to come speak on October 16th. So I hope we can fit, or we're allowed to have more than 25 people live. But either way, get your tickets for those as soon as you can. That'll be a lot of fun. He's a fun guy, and he'll be speaking on hemp. So hemp was a big deal a year ago before COVID. Remember the hemp craze? People were growing it. We're not sure how to dry it, how to process it. Nobody quite knows where the industry is going for non-cannabis hemp. But he's on the forefront of that, so he's going to talk about what's so great about hemp. And then, as is going to be our custom until June, we're going to do an event on the 10th of every month. Now, we're taking these month by month because of COVID. They're meant to be celebrations, dance parties, these kinds of things. And so Tom may have to just backpedal a little bit on some of those events. But we're going to do something on the 10th. It'll be some sort of art experience with our very own Ned Bustard. That's what I've been told. So, on the 10th of every month, we're celebrating 10 years in business, so it doesn't matter what it is. Sign up and come out. It's going to be a lot of fun. We've already had a few events. They've been great. So just check our site. You'll be getting emails about those things, and those will not be live streamed. All right, well, so tonight, if you're here and you got the link, hopefully we're up and running, and you're here to hear Dan Spanjer, I'll tell you a little bit about Dan, and he can tell you more if needed. Dan got his PhD from SUNY Albany, right, in history, and his specialty is American Christianity, and quite an historian and theologian in his own right. He actually did get a theological degree at Reformed Theological Seminary. He's married to Tara, and they have 3 young girls. Live here in Lancaster, and he teaches at Lancaster Bible College, professor of history. And so, let me tell you a little bit about why Dan's speaking about this tonight. Well, number one, he brings out the crowds. This thing sold out really quick, and he's our best-selling speaker. So that's number one. We're going for the money. We're just going for the numbers all the time. So anyway, so that's why we have Dan come, and he's good. He's a good speaker. He speaks good, and he's passionate, and he's informative and well-read. In fact, when I gave him this idea, I could see the wheels I could just see the smoke just coming out of his ears like that. Oh, that would be interesting. I haven't thought about that in a while. And I know he did research just for tonight's talk. And so that's for you guys, and that's really hard to find these days. But I wanted to do something with the pandemic that would be a bit sideways. And what I mean by that is, if all of us here have opinions about masks and how the government handled things, the CDC, we have strong opinions about things that are hot in the news, the protests, the demonstrations, the violence. And, oh, there's an election. And I think the skies are hazy from the smoke. So it's a kind of a weird time in America. But we all have opinions about these things. And we like to just go at them. I can't tell you the amount of times I've had people on all kinds of sides just give me their opinion about something. I didn't ask for it. I've done that, I didn't ask. But they just kind of pontificate to me. And what I find interesting about that is obviously that can be very polarizing. It can be very demeaning. We end up not listening to people. And I want the row house to be a bit more sideways. And what I mean by that is something more like art. Something more like a good novel, where topics are approached sideways, not directly, where you can stand back in that sideways position, take a better look at it, and not be so emotionally involved. Does that make sense? And maybe you're brought into it in a new emotion or new understanding. And good art does that. And I want the row house to be that. And so I didn't want to do the pandemic straight up, because I knew it would just bring out all your crazy opinions. And when I say your, I mean me. So I brought this idea up to Dan, and it's like went off like a light bulb. What about the Spanish flu? So our sideways approach tonight to what we're dealing with right now is by looking back in history. That's our side glance from history's point of view into this pandemic, which there's a book about it, which he'll reference, called The Forgotten Pandemic. I forgot about it because I was born in 1962. But all of us have forgotten about it. There was World War I. There were a lot of reasons for that. Why? It was such an important time and terrible time. Why do we just want to forget about it? So we're going to get into that a little bit. And I knew that that would be a good combination, a good way to engage current culture with ancient faith and historical perspective in a sideways approach. And I knew that Dan would be the guy to do it. So that's why I've asked him to come. So thank you, Dan, for doing this. So what the format is very simple. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A. And I will lead that with your questions. Hopefully, nice, curt, short question. I have a reminder about something. I can't forget. My helper's reminding me about these cards I just handed out. But anyway, the format is he'll speak, and then we'll have Q&A. All right. In your hands, if you're in the live event, you have a card. And because I like to give things away. I'm a generous guy. I like to have a little bit of fun. So I want you to look at your card. Everybody in this audience has a card of one of our past presidents. And if you have a president who was president during the Spanish flu, see that? You win. Or if you don't, if you've got the closest to 1918. Who's got it? What year do you got?
1892.
You have 1892. Who's got better than that?
I have 1923.
23, what do you got? 21? Anyone have 1918?
Ethan has it, but he just doesn't want to admit it.
Well, he wins.
Woodrow Wilson.
Do you have Woodrow Wilson?
I do have Woodrow Wilson.
All right, let's hear it for Ethan over there. Now, what I have here is what you have won for your folks at home is a zine. And all the kids know what a zine is. It's a magazine, a very small one. This is a hand-drawn zine, copied by a friend of mine who just graduated from Millersville, and she did a little chronicle of how the pandemic affected her life as a college student. It's this brilliant little thing. I got 5 of them. I've got 1 left. And Ethan, you win it. So come collect. Come collect. Here you are. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's welcome Dan Spanjer.
Thank you all. Thanks, Tom. I wish we'd have talked about that sideways thing before. That would have been hugely helpful. Tom, when Tom, he's right about the smoke coming out. My dissertation topic area is actually on young republic or early republic, religious and intellectual political history. Right, so looking at post-constitutional period, Atlantic world enlightenment, and how did the ideas develop in the Constitution. All that stuff was really fun and exciting. And lately I've been moving into the progressive era, because there's something about the change in the 1890s that sets us up as a country so well. The longer I've taught on it, the more I've read on it. So I did the American exceptionalism last time, and that dragged me into that era. And when he said pandemic, I thought, oh, untapped. The failure of progressives and the rise of the nationalist progressive movement, especially if you look at Woodrow Wilson's national election, but then you look at Wisconsin and the rise of progressives. Why did they fail so badly in 1918, which was this great test to prove that the government could solve all of our problems? And all of a sudden the lights were going off everywhere and the smoke was going off, just like Tom said. And I was so excited, and it dawned on me that he slipped me a fast one. He wasn't interested in history, he was interested in coronavirus. He wanted me to come sideways at that. And I was all of a sudden so bummed, because historians should never be commentators. Historians should never talk about anything unless it's at least 80 to 100 years old. Amen. Can I get an amen from the background? So I thought what Tom is asking me to be is a mythological creature, a historian, who my friend as another historian says should never be a prophet or a commentator, and now I'm forced into that role. Like other mythological creatures today, like maybe a rational journalist. Possibly an ethical politician. Or maybe even a social media post that promotes understanding. None of these things exist, and now I am going to be a similar mythical creature. I'm going to talk about something related to the present when I ought not do that. So I am going to do that. It took me a lot of pain and trial to actually reference the present, but I'm going to do it. I'm obviously interested more at this point as to what happened in 1918, and Tom was referencing Alfred Crosby's book, The Forgotten Pandemic. But there is more. John Barry's book on the pandemic, and also Lawrence Spinney's book, a brilliant book on the history of the pandemic, all arrived at the same conclusion. For some reason, this thing, which killed, we don't know exactly the number because records being so poor in the early part of the 20th century, somewhere between, if we're fairly reasonable, 40 to 150 million, and we don't know the exact number between there. That outnumbers by far the Black Death. That outnumbers Justinian's. Justinian's plague in the 6th century killed roughly 50% of the human population, also forgotten these days. But given the Earth's population, it was about 40 or 50 million people. At least that's a wild guess, right? And the Black Death does some similar numbers. 60% of European population is dead. But then again, given the European population, we're still talking something about 30 to 40 million people. Where the pandemic, striking in 1918, kills 100 million, literally more than World War I. And we think of World War I as a break point in human civilization, where we're actually experiencing more death than life in a war. And yet that's fractional compared to something like the 1918 pandemic. And yet, if you go looking for it, you can hardly find it. No one talks about it. As a matter of fact, and this will shock you, brought up Woodrow Wilson, you can scour the textbooks. Woodrow Wilson never made a single public comment about the influenza panic. He made one comment, and the comment was to a friend of his because they were trying to figure out how to get troop ships from here to Europe, and the pandemic was shutting down the flow of troops, and he complained, why is the flu shutting down our troop ships? That's the one comment in a private conversation he had about a pandemic that killed, are you ready? Between April, when it first made its appearance in Kansas, to the following February, March, when it finally slowed down, 675,000 Americans. 675,000 Americans, 0.6% of the American population died. Now here's another crazy statistic. Ready for this one? The life expectancy over those years dropped in 1918, 1919, on average, 11.8 years. But to consider the impact of dropping the global life expectancy 11 years, the impact that has on society, culture, community. I mean, that's incredible. That's beyond almost what we in this day and age can imagine, and yet no one talks about it. Now, there's two other flu pandemics which we might not know about, and I won't ask you whether you lived through them, but 1957, the Asiatic flu, and then 1968, the Hong Kong flu. Both of those killed in excess of 1 million people. And again, similarly, and I teach on the 1960s, it's one of my favorite classes to teach on, and I'm humbled by this. So when I found that out recently, I've never mentioned the Hong Kong flu talking on the 60s, and yet over 100,000 Americans died right at the point of civil rights crisis. Do you think that played a part in the unsettledness? Well, look what coronavirus is doing and what it's contributing. We won't know that again for another 80 to 100 years. Again, the historian in me. But nonetheless, that must have had a tremendous impact on the civil rights movement, and yet, I've gone through 2 textbooks on that, and there's not a single mention of 116,000 Americans dying in 2 pandemics. It's crazy. So why is that? And that got me thinking as to what about this pandemic sort of drives that, and why did we get to the point where we don't really want to mention it? Not that we don't want to, but we've forgotten it for some reason. And then that got me thinking, why can't we stop talking about this one? And there's a dissonance, there's a tension between those two that I started exploring a little into. And I'm going to throw a couple conclusions at you that I've come to after doing some research about exactly why that's happened. And I think you'll find that interesting, at least I found it interesting. So whether you find it interesting or not, it's irrelevant. I thoroughly enjoyed the research I did on this project. And now I'm interested in sort of digging a little further in some of these other areas that I get to go into. So what was the pandemic of 1918? It was a flu pandemic. Not unlike the coronavirus, but a coronavirus and flu virus are slightly different in the way they function. The flu virus is not new necessarily. It's been around for centuries, but it really has never had that kind of an impact on human population. It appeared really as an epidemic in the late 1890s in Eastern Russia. There was a flu pandemic that had high mortality rates, and people couldn't figure out what it was. Now the flu's been around. In fact, does anybody, I'm going to ask this, silly people online can't answer, why the term influenza? It's an Italian word, and if you know you're Italian, you'll know that it means influence. The idea they thought originally was you got sick seasonally because of the influence of the stars and the moons. So influence, influenza, this is what happens. The other term used for the influenza was grip, and if you look back at anything old, you'll see they've got the grip. And that's nothing to do with their hands. They're in the grip of something. Their body is weakened, they can't move, so they're in the grip. That's a common thing. It's sort of a seasonal flu. People go through it. It's not the killer that tuberculosis was. In human history, up until the 20th century, and this is a crazy statistic, 1 out of every 7 human beings died of tuberculosis, from ancient history to the present. Holy mackerel. Or the cholera epidemics that break out across Europe and America in the 19th century. Flu was considered a normal thing. Lawrence Spinney argues that one of the reasons we didn't pay a great deal of attention to it is because everybody gets it. If you get typhoid, if you get cholera, that's a different thing. We're going to talk in a minute about why. But influenza, everybody gets. So maybe the reason why we didn't pay attention to it was because it was so common. Well, it's common until the death rates pile up in your city, and you can't stop it. And then that changes things. So it's not that there weren't these sorts of things happening before. The epidemic that broke out in Russia in the 1890s was particularly devastating because of the casualty rates. Sometimes the casualty rates as high as 20-30% of those that contracted it. And we're looking at coronavirus, and we don't know the exact number now. Again, I shouldn't dabble in these areas. But 1%, 2% the highest, 0.8%, I'm not exactly sure where the number's going to land eventually. It depends on how the scientists figure it out. You're talking about something that kills 20 to 30%? That's unimaginable. Similar influenza broke out actually in Western China, right around 1916, 1917. The death rates there in some communities, you ready for this? 80%. 80%. There were entire communities wiped out by a flu bug that raced through Western China. So it's not that something like this is quite unusual in one sense. In fact, I think it was Lawrence Spinney that made this argument that in human history, up until now, we all were going to die of some one of these catastrophic diseases. Now that we've stopped them, we all die of wasting diseases. We don't die of catastrophic diseases. And so we've changed the vocabulary about what's dangerous. But if you were to go back 80, 90 years ago, we were all going to die at some point of a flu or a cholera or a typhoid outbreak, tuberculosis, something that was going to kill us, rather violently. And so the flu bug that hits really isn't unusual in that regard because that's sort of a typical human experience. But something about the 1918 flu is even crazier than that. And of course, that's the way that attacks culture and society. Let me just talk about the flu bug just briefly because it's going to matter for why it spreads and what happens later. And since coronavirus is everywhere, you're probably familiar now with, and this happens to us when these things occur, right? We all of a sudden become scientific experts. Right? I remember when my wife had children, all of a sudden I knew everything about childbirth. I've forgotten everything since then, so I don't know anything anymore. But now we know everything about viruses, right? But a virus, specifically a flu virus, is it's smaller than a human cell, and it attaches itself to a cell, typically the epithelial cells, and these would be cells lining your skin, but they tend to attack the ones that go all the way from your throat down to your lungs. That's the more sensitive place for the flu to go. And the flu virus will break its way into the cell. It's got some receptors on its front, that's the H, if you've ever heard flu viruses, H1N1, H2N3, those sorts of things. The H refers to its ability to synthesize the surface of the cell and then to gain access into the cell. What happens with the H1N1, which is what they're thinking was the flu virus in 1918, we don't actually know, I'll talk about that in a second, is that it would make its way to the epithelial cells, and then of course it would turn the cellular mechanisms into a cell-producing machine, and the virus will now replicate. In 10 hours after contracting this virus, the cell will then rupture, having been destroyed by the virus, and now will unleash somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 replicas of the virus onto the next cells of the body. So if that's the rate of production and change, from 1 cell to 10,000 cells in 10 hours, I'm going to ask someone to do the math here about how this then extrapolates from there on down the line, to the point where the body simply just cannot defend itself. And usually what happens then is the body breaks down and becomes weaker, and then other things tend to work their way into the body and kill. Rarely does the flu virus kill anybody. It's the bacteria that come along with it. Pneumococcal, typically that create pneumonia, are the ones that will make their way into the body at that point once the flu has done its hard work of breaking down the defenses. And what's different about the H1N1, at least we think that's what it was, or some variant thereof, is not that it's particularly destructive, it's particularly invasive. Rather than just getting into the throat and the bronchioles, it actually goes all the way down into the lungs to the alveoli. Every little part ends up contracting it, which means you weaken the system from the very depth of the lungs all the way to the throat. And with that, you create this wide open opportunity for everything else to make its way in. So it's particularly destructive because it's particularly, and this is the key to the flu virus, particularly unsuccessful. What do I mean by that? It's very good at invading, but the one thing the virus cell is not very good at is identical replication of itself over and over again. The flu virus, actually, every time it replicates, it makes mistakes in its reproduction. And once it does that, the body that gets used to fighting it in the first 10,000 that come out, miss it on the second group, and the third group, and the fourth group. And so the body finds itself fighting very hard to defend against a constant new invader from the inside, as the invasion now changes the way that it functions, and the body can't keep up with it. What happens, of course, in this 1918, and this is something we don't really know about, and historians and doctors will have to figure it out, is why did it spread so quickly? And this is something we're going to look at as we see in 1918, as this really develops. Things are going to change rather dramatically. In fact, it's going to go from people to ship to people to farm to city at rates that almost human beings couldn't travel at that day. It almost looked mythological the way that it was in fact moving. What about the influenza? Where does it come from? Now, this is an interesting argument, interesting debate. We know where it went. That's not hard to track the coffins. Actually, by the time this thing really hit in the fall of 1918, there weren't any coffins. Coffins actually went up in price by about 600% in most of the main cities because, of course, they couldn't find them anymore. And they're starting to dump bodies into cloth bags if they could find them was really lucky. But mostly what happened is they rotted in homes, sometimes to the tune of thousands, while people had no idea what to do with them. So where did this come from as it's wreaking this kind of havoc on people? Well, we don't know. And I'm sure by now you've heard that it most likely came from Haskell County, Kansas. Anybody heard that? Hands up, you've heard this argument? Yes, the Haskell County, Kansas argument, right? Camp Funston in March, and I can give you the date, March 5th, 1918. March 5th, 1918, someone checked into the health part of the camp and said, I'm not feeling well, I think of a flu, and the doctor went, isn't interesting. That's a pretty virulent flu for this time of the year. It's strange it's happening in spring. On March 11th, it was growing so quickly he decided to report it to his officers to let them know, I think we have a problem here in Haskell County because soldiers are coming down with this like crazy. They also noticed that in fact the farmers around the area were also having or going through up through that winter a rather bad flu season, nothing out of ordinary or off the charts, but it was just a fairly bad flu, and so it was chalked up to, I think we have a bad flu year, not knowing exactly what they had on their hands. That became the first wave of the pandemic, which in fact will spread across the country from there off to the harbors and eventually make its way to Europe. That's the argument we've all heard and up to this point have believed. There's another argument that people have used, and that was this probably started in a camp in Etaples in northern France. After the Battle of the Somme, if you're familiar with World War I, 1916, a lot of deaths. They piled all the bodies up and the sick and wounded all together in northern France, right at the same place where all the troops are coming over from England to join the war, and in this terrible concoction of death and disease and health, something mutated. We also know, and that's possible because the flu bug actually rarely mutates in humans. It usually mutates in birds first. That's why we call it the avian flu, and you've heard this maybe around, or the swine flu. Birds harbor the flu, mutate it healthily. It doesn't attack them, they just mutate it, and then through fluids or through air will end up transporting it, and once it's capable, it'll jump to humans. And then, of course, the avian flu breaks out with its own disaster. So that's quite possible. It could have come from northern France because they noticed a really bad case of the flu in 1917 there for the injured and dying that could have then spread to the battlefields and then over to America. Also likely. However, the recent research has actually changed all of that. What they're now starting to argue is the flu most likely started in Western China. In 1917, the flu bug that hit was so virulent that in fact the local doctors lost total control of the situation. They couldn't even supply general aid anymore. In fact, the government, the Manchu government at the time, was going through its own revolution against reformers and wanted that thing tamped down, and so doctors were really restricted in managing the problem, not that they probably could have anyway. What a historian has recently done is shown that actually what happened was, right as that flu bug was dying down, the British were hiring Chinese workers to come over and work in Europe and help to dig trenches and bring supplies in. So into France poured nearly 150,000 Chinese workers, many of them from Western China. And the new historians are now starting to say they can start to track the early flu bug now from there back through the Atlantic, comes across troop ships not from here to Europe, but from Europe to here, and then we see it appear in Camp Funston in Kansas. So I'm gonna have to go with the modern, sort of recent history on that and say that it happened that way. The shock here is the speed at which it goes from the spring, late winter, early spring of 1918, from Europe trench diggers to Boston, Philadelphia, and Kansas within less than a month. We're talking Kansas. I want you to put on your geography hat for a minute and find Kansas and the nearest port. You start to see what we're up against? You've got a flu bug that travels so fast that it doesn't require main avenues even to move this thing across the entire country. So we even see it in Camp Haskell. We're seeing it in Kansas. It's come through the ports. We don't even know it's there yet by the time it's making people sick in Kansas. So why is this bug so different? Partly it's different because of the speed at which it's moving. Partly it's different, and this is a bit of a shock to the people at the time. But typically when you talk about epidemics, you're talking about ones that strike the poor predominantly. Cholera, bad water, typhoid, local. It needs to be sometimes through fluids, but usually through local communities. These things typically happen where there are bad health. In fact, the general theory at the time was called the miasma theory. And the idea was you got sick because there was bad air. Well, bad air from war, bad air from guns, bad air from sickness, maybe rotting flesh, dead horses in the city, all sorts of reasons. You get this funk break out in the city and it poisons your body. Well, maybe that makes sense to you, except it happened in Kansas. See, this is a problem. There was really no theory to explain how quickly this thing moved from one part of the world to the next. And the thing is, it didn't strike the poor, it struck everybody. It struck the poor and the rich, and it didn't matter how clean your lifestyle was, and it didn't matter where you lived, and it didn't matter what kind of health care you had. You died anyway. And you didn't die in 2 weeks, you sometimes died in 8 hours, 10 hours. There were stories of perfectly healthy people who would cough at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the next day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon were dead. Not cough and then you suffer for several weeks in an ICU. In fact, there were stories, and this happened in Alaska, where they were probably struck the hardest, is that an aid worker, actually it was a government official, came to a house where they hadn't heard anything, because they knew there were problems, and they came into the girl and said, "Honey, where's your mother?" She said, "She went in to see my father." He walked in, and not only was he dead, she was laying on top of him, apparently giving him a blanket when she died. All probably within 15 or 20 minutes of each other. I mean, what kind of virulent flu moves at this pace? And I'll give you one more, and this is the really frightening, if that's not frightening enough. The highest age group of death, ready for this? 24 to 28. The highest death rate. So what's shocking about the flu, typically it has what they call a V pattern, where it catches the young and the very old, and then it goes way down when you get to the people of middle age or people of youth, and then it shoots back up again over 60. Actually quite the opposite with this flu bug. The highest casualty, the 3 highest age groups for casualty were 24 to 28, 29 to 32, and 20 to 24. You know where the lowest death rate was? Over 60. That's incredible. Now, think not only about how terrifying that is, not that death isn't terrifying for everyone, but I want you to think of what that does to communities. When what it's attacking is the very thing that World War I is attacking. The youth generation who's responsible for doing everything from growing the crops in the next season, to running the industries in the next season, to fathering children in the next season. So we're not just talking about a pandemic where people die, which is bad enough. It's hitting at the very root of the capability of society to continue its normal functioning. When you're killing and wiping out in huge numbers the people in the middle part of the age group, you are devastating the population and industry. The other things that come with this are really quite shocking, I think, also. Just the death rate, the number of people that die. I'll give you this interesting statistic when I ran the math on this, that for the time being, the country's population, for 675,000 to die, that's 0.6% of the population. If we extrapolate that to today's population, that's 2 million. So 2 million, think of our economy and society losing 2 million breadwinners, pregnant women, young families, children. Like, this is who it actually strikes more than anybody else. And in some cities, of course, it's even more virulent than that. Lancaster actually was given a name during this. It was called the besieged city, because Lancaster went into a lockdown and couldn't slow the deaths. Now, it was much smaller, so when you talk about 500 deaths, it doesn't sound big. When you talk about the average across the population, it actually shuts the entire economy of Lancaster down. The city, of course, with the worst damage sort of follows our own coronavirus, was New York City, and then Philadelphia, and then Chicago. You can start to make explanations as to why that's the case. And the problem with these is not only the death rates, 15,000, 20,000, New York City 30,000 in 10 months, but you're talking about the time frame that these deaths are happening in. So quickly, as a matter of fact, the hospitals, there was a recovery hospital in Philadelphia. It was called the Emergency Hospital No. 2. In the middle of the second wave, which struck in the fall, September through November, they were losing 25% of their patients a day. a quarter of everyone that went in the hospital a day, which was already expanded beyond its capacity and limits, was dying per day. They couldn't actually move the bodies. They didn't know what to do with them. And to make matters worse, specifically in Philadelphia, this happened in all the other cities as well, is the workers, grave diggers, usually assigned to this, refused to do their jobs. So not only did you have dead piling up, in fact, in one of the morgues in Philadelphia, they didn't know what to do with the bodies, so they started stacking them in the hallways and all around the back rooms. When the police went in to figure out what the stench was, they found 3-4 stacks high of dead bodies lining the entire inside of the morgue out onto the stoop outside. You have to get rid of the bodies. I don't know how. One of the big problems in Alaska is that it struck in the middle of winter, and they actually couldn't bury the bodies. It was costing, to an Inuit Alaskan, somewhere over $600 just to get a single burial in. And they couldn't afford it because you couldn't break through the permafrost. Or not the permafrost, but the winter's frost. So the scale, we're not just talking about scale, we're talking about a crunch timeline where things are happening so rapidly there actually is no solution to the problem. I thought this was ironic that the group that actually stepped up and solved the problem in Philadelphia, you're going to get this, were the police and the Catholics. So if you want to talk about a little ironic twist, right? It's the police and the Catholics that actually took on extra shifts just to bury dead. And don't think the police didn't pay for that one. The death rates among nuns, Catholic workers, priests, and police officers, sometimes 10, 15, 20, 30% death rates. Of course, because they're moving dead bodies infected with virus, which in fact then infected them as well. Now, I say all of this because what I'm curious about, now that you're hearing just bits and pieces, and we haven't even talked about some of the harder parts internationally, for example. What happened in Southeast Asia? What happened in Russia? 2.7 million dead in Russia, and we're not talking about Alaska. In Alaskan populations, in some towns, it was not uncommon along the panhandle of southern Alaska for death rates of 30 to 40%. There was a single village, I found this rather distressing, a single village of 85 adults had been a population and a culture that had been around for about 250, 300 years. Of the 85 adults, 75 died in 10 days. 75 out of 85 adults die in 10 days. And in effect, and I think this is the point that Alfred Crosby was making, you wiped out an entire culture in 2 weeks. Lost. The children that survived that knew nothing of their own history and were moved off to other villages. The village actually closed down and disappeared. Okay, this is all rather grim, I admit. You told me to do this, Tom, so I can tell you, it's been difficult to look at all this and start to study the stories of all the people dying, but here's the question that comes out of it. So why have we forgotten it? That's what's really hard to explain. This is not like it happens in the backwater, no one knows about it. This happens in the key cities, it shuts down arteries, it destroys local communities. And all of a sudden, by the time you get to 1920, it's almost entirely forgotten. Lauren Spinney made this point. She said, look through the literature of the day and you only find 2 real mentions. One was a book called Pale Rider, where a woman who survived the flu actually wrote a novel about herself so she could tell what it was like to go through the flu. A brilliant novel, it's worth a read. And one other mention of it that shows up in another novel because a character ends up getting the flu. Other than that, no one. How many novels have used the flu as the backdrop for an existential crisis? For a problem in their marriage, in their family? Don't you think that would form the basic material for any discussion you would have? And yet Ernest Hemingway, writing about these very issues, chooses World War I even though he himself comes down with the flu. Why does he not mention it? Woodrow Wilson, by the way, got the flu also in Paris and decided not to mention that either. So why is that? And that's what struck me, because as I'm looking at our country, and our world dealing with this, and I'm not saying, and please hear me say, anyone that dies is a tragedy, and I'm not saying that somehow comparing numbers is enough to get at the root of the difference, but nonetheless, to face that kind of cataclysm, and 3 or 4 years later for it to totally disappear from culture is a shock. And I came to this conclusion, and this is what I've been wrestling with. Why in their pandemic was it so individually unforgettable, but nationally unmemorable? Because what I'm finding with our own coronavirus is it's individually largely very unmemorable, but nationally unforgettable. Why is that? Why can our nation not get over this when they got over that one so quickly? And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong. I'm just shocked historically by how this is being handled. And of course, that's what ended up driving a lot of my research, although I was very interested in a lot of the data and learning about viruses and flus that I never knew about before. Largely that went past me. What I'm really intrigued by is why the culture responds the way it has. I'm not sure I've got a total answer for that, but I got a couple things I want to mention that may help us explain why that happened. And maybe explain a little bit, and Tom, here's where I'm getting way off the reservation, what we might know about our culture because of that. Let me mention as a segue into this issue, or why this was so easily forgotten, as to the name of the Spanish flu itself. And I think this has been misunderstood. And I'm novel in this regard, and I probably should be careful. Other historians spent more time, will probably say more than I will. But we call it the Spanish flu or the Spanish lady. And the question is, why have we chosen Spain to be labeled with the flu when, number one, it didn't come from there, and number two, they didn't even face the heaviest casualties of the darn thing? Well, there's a reason why. What was going on, and Tom mentioned this before, what was going on while the Spanish flu was raging? 3 phases, April into the summer, October into November, 3rd phase, if you got it, some places did December into March and April, and then it disappeared, sort of whisked away, came up small communities later, but nothing really serious. What was going on? World War I. Okay. World War I, of course, was the most potent, deadly, devastating, and ideologically driven war, probably in our history. Even if you look at something like Napoleon, equally destructive in its day, not ideological. World War I, very much so. Communism, the Russian Revolution, all these various different things happening. World War I, of course, was sweeping the world. Think of the countries that were involved. America just got involved, in fact, that previous year. In fact, our troops were now heading over to Europe in order to get engaged in the combat. Russia was involved. France was involved. Germany was involved. England, Italy. Which of the European countries was not involved? Spain, interestingly enough. Spain was not involved. They weren't committed to the war. Their lives were not being disrupted or defined by the ideological power and impression of the war. So what did they have time to focus on? And what's interesting about the Spanish reference here is that their press tacked this very strongly. Their king, Alfonso, ended up getting sick with this in September, sort of drew international attention that the king of Spain is now sick with the flu. And of course the media were running rampant with it. The argument traditionally is this, that Spain's media was not in fact controlled by the government because they weren't at war. In other words, what happened in Germany was controlled by the German government. They didn't want word getting out that their lines were weakened, so they didn't talk about the flu. Same thing with Russia, same thing with America. Sounds good, except no one was talking about it. It wasn't like the media was hiding it. No one was interested in it. How can Russians not be interested in a flu that kills 2.7 million Russians? Why? Because what's going on in Russia in 1918? The Russian Revolution, which was overturning their entire world. So the reason the Spanish flu gets named the Spanish flu is because Spain had very little interest in a global conflict that was basically a cultural black hole for everyone else. And I think now we start to get a picture. What about war made the Spanish flu a secondary news item? And I'll give you another example, and this is another little interesting one that comes up because of its place in the world. Odessa, along the Black Sea, also got the flu the same time Russia did. Its casualties were a lot lower than Russia, but Odessa became somewhat obsessed with it. Why? Because Odessa was entirely outside the war, outside the revolution, not interested in the goings-on of the global pandemic, global wartime. What they're really interested in was summer vacation coming up. And guess what? That got thoroughly disrupted by the flu. But what did not get disrupted by the flu? World War I. Now, it did slow things down, and there's some interesting history around all of that. But I find it interesting that if you look at the countries that were dealing with this, it turns out that the war and what it was doing was so much more memorable that people at home could ignore the death of family, the death of friends, the death of children in light of this massive war that was, this massive influenza that was killing everyone, or at least a lot of people. Listen to this, and this is a quote. Let's see if I can find it here. This is a quote from Alfred Crosby that I find very interesting because Crosby was wrestling with this same fact a little bit. And Crosby makes an argument here. Ooh, maybe I can't find it, and I'll have to just tell you what he said. I'll have to quote it from memory, and that's not a good idea. I was hoping to be able to give it to you directly. But Alfred Crosby makes this statement. Sorry, I can't find it right in front of me. My eyes are getting bad. Where he says, flus like this have a tendency to do one of two things. They can either drive a country to disruption and disunity, or they can drive it towards unity. And he says this, oddly enough, for whatever the calculation and combination was, in 1918, it pulled America together. And when I read that, I thought, I don't feel that happening now. Right? The flu actually says Crosby, actually may have played a tremendous role in fact, pulling the country back together in a unity, even though, of course, its death and destruction was far greater than anything we're seeing this time around. I went and did this. When I got wind of that, I started another line of research that I wanted to go through, and that was to look at newspaper reports and only do a little bit of this. So newspaper reports from 1918 to see how they dealt with this. And a very interesting correlation appeared. When they talked about the influenza, although they talked about it as a problem, when they talked about it as a major problem, they talked about it as a war problem. This is from I think, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Oh no, this is a sign, that was hanging on a port outside the street. Listen to this. Spanish influenza has endangered the prosecution of the war in Europe. There are 1,500 cases in the Naval Yard. 30 deaths have already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza. Don't spit. Why don't spit? Because your neighbor is in trouble? Because your mom might die? No, because you could hurt the war effort in Europe. Can you imagine? As a matter of fact, this will continue. There was a movement at the time, of course, which was the Liberty Loans, which Wilson helped start to get people to raise money for the sake of World War I. It turns out the Liberty Loan marches were happening just as the influenza was spreading. And where some doctors were saying, I think you have to stay inside, people were rushing out into marches that included 50 to 200,000 people. And the Liberty Loan marches were telling people either you're patriotically going to give, or in fact you're going to damage the war effort. Listen to this Liberty Loan Committee ad. Don't get influenza in your pocketbooks, but let your example of patriotic subscribing be tremendously contagious. There's no quarantine against that. In France, the people have gone through 4 years of war. In the meanwhile, have suffered untold misfortune. But France has not quit. In America, are you going to let an influenza epidemic stop you? I mean, is that trivializing a pandemic that's killing 600,000 Americans in just weeks? The Baltimore Sun said this in the fall of 1918. Now, while the enemy is reeling, is the time to deal the final blow that will guarantee freedom and civilization for the world, and blow that will bring righteous peace. Have you done your part? And you know what they were talking about? Not spinning in public. So in other words, are you willing to give yourself, not for the sake of your own safety, but the sake of the nation's? The Boston Globe wrote this October 4th, 1918, and I think this is the clincher. Ready for this? Compare this to our own modern culture dealing with coronavirus. To conquer the epidemic will be to remove a menace to our war program, more serious than anything German plotters have accomplished. All of us can help by doing our utmost to keep ourselves well for the war effort. Listen to this. The individual's health is more than an individual asset. It is a community asset, an item in a successful war program. So how have the 1918 folks positioned the 1918 epidemic? They've not positioned it as a threat to you or to me or my neighbor or my community. It's a threat to global peace because the war effort is your entire responsibility. This then gets to, I think, the heart of how our understanding of the pandemic then and our understanding of now can be so different. Notice how we think of war as a metaphor in our time. War typically is that which rallies a people around some sort of grand ideal where you sacrifice yourself to it. Now we've got wars declared on poverty, wars declared on terror, wars declared on diseases. Notice the difference. In the war that we call 1918, World War I, it was the sacrifice of the individual to the greater good or some bigger ideal. What are these wars? This is a way of thinking of a war of a sacrifice of the corporate for the sake of the individual. We flip the narrative on the way we typically think about what a war is and what it's supposed to accomplish. And that allows certain states at different times, especially during a time like this, to be able to say, I know this is bad for you, but this is not the important feature. It's what's going on in Germany if they win. And now the individual becomes, as we can say here, an instrument in a larger responsibility, and that is the war effort. That's an amazing turnaround from a modern culture which has a different view. And please don't hear me say that one of these is better than the other. You can decide that for yourselves. But it's intriguing to me that under that view, a pandemic of that violence can be so quickly forgotten and put in a different perspective. The war metaphor is a powerful metaphor. Partly the reason why the war metaphor works and why we declared war on poverty under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s is because what it's meant to do is to rally everything around a national cause, a central cause, for which people will sacrifice. Of course, any of these wars, as they're meant to fight, are there to save the soldier. Imagine, if you will, just a mental experiment where you start a war to save the soldiers you send. What does the strategy look like? What's the victory look like? What's the continuation of the war look like? Of course, a war like World War I is inverse from that. In fact, the goal of the war is to use the individual for some other endeavor. And so sending our men to the front lines was, in fact, something noble. When they would do the ceremonies for soldiers, and by the way, more soldiers died of influenza than German bullets and guns. And of course, you have to hold a funeral for these soldiers. In fact, in Philadelphia, at one time when the fall hit of 1918, 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers were dying a week. 2,000 to 4,000 were dying a week. Never got to the front lines. What do you think the funerals were? Celebrations of heroism. Died on the front lines. The idea that a soldier would commit himself to this, even if he only got from Camp Funston to Philadelphia to die in an infirmary ward, that man was a hero because he gave himself to the war, even if he never got to fight it. And similarly, people that were dying at the time, even civilians, their sacrifice was seen on a larger stage as somehow giving to it. That was rather indirect at times, but you could see them stretching to make the effort. This death wasn't meaningless, it was for something else, for the nation, for the people, for the community. It's hard to argue when you get down into exactly how a people come to that conclusion. And of course, we've seen countries thinking that way create a lot of disaster. So I'm not saying that when people start to give themselves up for the sake of their nation, good things happen. We've seen nationalism break out in different ways in Europe, and it's created all kinds of havoc. But I'm curious now as to how we as a country are going to frame this once it's over. I'm not sure in our postmodern mentality we've got a really good metaphor to work off of in order to frame that. I think what's interesting, probably also, if you look back a little further, and I'm way off here, Tom, so I'm going to be cautious with this one. But in the idea of a political identity, you always give up the individual's identity to an aggregate. Right? I don't matter, the state matters. I don't matter, the nation matters. The aggregate has usually been something larger than just my physical surroundings, my inheritance, my parents, my grandparents, my children, my future children. You've got this massive aggregate in mind that you're now serving. As a matter of fact, for most people up until modern times, that was a religious thing. You're serving something even supernatural beyond that. And I think what's happened in our own political thought is the aggregate identity has shrunk from not only a transgenerational group, maybe even a translocal group, down to the individual. So the individual becomes the new loyalty mode. And this is what we have to do. Serve the individual, and the more we do that, we'll find security. And in fact, I think we're finding quite the opposite. To the degree where people can die to the tune of hundreds of thousands in the matter of weeks, and somehow the country can put it into some sort of focus. Again, don't hear me say that I think that's the right way to handle this. I don't know what the right way to handle it is. I'm a historian. I'm not an ethicist. I don't make moral decisions. You just try to look at it and ask, how do these people come to these conclusions, and where did it go? I'm going to do one other thing, Tom, and then I'm going to stop. I'm going to tie the two pandemics together. You never saw this coming, by the way. Not that coming. You never saw coming what I'm about to say. Because when I discovered this, I had to read it like 3 times to understand that, and it's actually true. During the pandemic, one of the ways that you could track its real cost was life insurance companies. Life insurance companies gave out somewhere to the tune of, by modern numbers, $20 billion in payouts to people. That wasn't 20 billion then, but that's 2020 numbers. And a lot of families, no matter who you were, could apply for the life insurance depending on where you fell. And a lot of immigrant families did. And there happened to be a family, a German family, that had come over from Germany just as World War I was cranking up, and they were poor. And the husband ends up contracting influenza in the fall and ends up dying. The wife, mother of 2, I believe, is encouraged to apply for that life insurance money in order to give herself a new income. She goes through with it, she gets the income, doesn't know what to do with it. She's stuck with a couple $100, doesn't know where to go with it, doesn't want to spend it, so she decides to invest it in property. Her last name? Trump. You never saw that coming. Trump's grandmother invested that money from the life insurance company in property, and they became property moguls. And Trump now, of course, is where he is. So I just tied the 2 pandemics together. On that note.
Well, thank you, Dan, for tying that together so tidily. All right, well, let's if we bring our chairs up, that'll help. We just, I can reach my computer. Good. All right. Well, again, that was great, Dan. Thank you so much. And for sticking to the historian thing, that's good. We want that.
That's where I'm coming.
All right, good. All right, so if you're watching on the live stream, if you have the YouTube link and you have I think a Google account, you should be able to put in your questions. You also got a link. You also got my text number. So I'm hoping some of you guys out there in TV land will send some questions. And I had a question to lead off with, but I'll wait. I'm going to wait and see if we have any questions in the audience here that people are sitting on and love to ask Dan. And again, the rules are basically make it a question. Try to keep it short and feel free to ask him anything. So, anything out there? Anybody's? Don't be bashful just because you're on national television. Actually, it's a private link, so you're really not on national television yet. Yes, in the front row.
The other thing that was going on was women's suffrage. I mean, starting way back in the 1820s, but it really got heated up. The early part of it. And so I watched the PBS, the 2-part vote documentary, and the Spanish flu, to my memory, if it was mentioned, it was barely mentioned.
Right.
It was just focusing on all the players. But that didn't even occur to me that would have been something when they're organizing these women for all these marches.
Right.
So
it wasn't.
So the question, I have to repeat it for the audio.
Yeah.
So something like, how did the women's suffrage play into it, or how was it affected
Yeah.
by the Spanish flu?
Yeah, and I think that's the issue becomes a cultural issue, I think, to me, is where are the cultural values that they didn't see that as an obstacle to the kind of things they were doing. And this is where if I were to get off on really historically wonky, which I won't do to you nice people, is looking at the development of progressivism, which the women's suffrage was one example of, as were labor unions and other of these developments, and how those were becoming culturally mainstreamed in this time. Which led to lots of things, their success and their failure in a lot of different ways. Women's suffrage actually succeeded, where other ones did not. But these cultural movements sort of gained such a momentum on their own that they became the identity of the people living in them. So for example, if you look at a lot of labor unions, and you'll know this today if you've got parents or some of you work in certain industries, I'm a union man. I mean, that's not a casual, that's where I work. That's an identity, that's who I am. When that identity gets formed, it turns out, and I think this is the fascinating thing about culture, that becomes the superior quality of your identity, not something like death, which gets in the way of it.
Right.
Winston Churchill famously said right after the disaster in Turkey during World War I, and he lost his position, he went to the front lines in Europe to regain his reputation, and he wrote a letter home to his wife, and he said, "Darling, death is not the worst thing to happen to a man." Okay. And I think what you see is there's this metal, if we can call it that, among the women in the suffrage movement, among the reformers of the day, where they didn't see that as an obstacle necessarily to their identity. That was just their life. They died, that's fine, but they belong to something different. And until you have that sort of mentality, war doesn't make a ton of sense. But in World War I and then World War II again, somehow people developed that beyond what I think you and I could probably imagine.
Yeah, it reminds me of folks that work in a rural setting or more labor-oriented folks, agricultural people,
Right.
to this day, have a mentality more like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Less fear of death.
Right, and well, there's a tradition they belong to, right? And again, so here's the challenge. Where's your aggregate community, right? I mean, what's the political identity resting in? And I think in my own life, I can see that the more it becomes me, the more fear takes over, right? And the more the slight things become unforgettable to me. Where when that aggregate grows, I'm living for my children, and for my church, and my community, and my culture. This grows, it changes my relationship to all these things.
Well, doesn't also, if you have a bunch of individualists all, going out the world on their own,
Right.
and that fear kicks in, all those people look for someone
Yeah.
to help them, save them, make it better.
Right. Right.
Looking to our president as being some kind of healer in chief kind of thing.
Right.
And I wonder if that's coming out of what you're saying. Like, we don't have as many safety nets in place to go with
Yeah.
our fears.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's what, I can't get to underneath that for 2020, because again, I'm a historian.
You're
so
a historian.
It's too recent for me to get at.
All right, stay in your lane.
Thank you, 100 years old. Anything less than 100 years is called a current event. World War II is still a current event.
You can pop out of your lane occasionally.
That's right.
I see, I didn't see any come in. Wait, here's a question that just came in off the wire here. It's kind of like the Beatles. All you need is love, and they had the satellites, and they sat in a room, and millions of people. Never mind.
I've never been compared to the Beatles.
1968. This is like a love-in.
Okay.
What we're doing is a love-in. Question: can Dan recommend a reference overview of the impact of epidemics in the history of the world?
I don't have anything broadly on epidemics.
That's from Dave. Thank you, Dave.
That's a good question.
Can you tell us what epidemics are?
Yeah, sure. I guess. Not a medical guy. But epidemic is, of course, when a disease ends up affecting a certain population, right? So it's not just, a small group. An epidemic has to be larger.
Yeah.
Pandemic, of course, has to be all. And there have been there's a guy, and I should know this, there's a historian, and I watched his lectures at Harvard on epidemics, and unfortunately the name is just out of my head. But on the Spanish influenza specifically, probably the best is Crosby's work. Although there's also a book recently out by John Barry, B-A-R-R-Y, The Story of the Great Influenza Pandemic, which is also very readable. And Spinney's is good too. So there's 3 I can toss your way. I'd have to get back to you on the epidemic one.
Cool, thanks. And in the audience, I'll restate it for you, sir.
How did the church respond to this crisis?
So the question is, how did the church respond to this? And of course, you want to define church, but what was a faith-based response to the Spanish flu?
That's a great question, Ned, and I expect your book to come out shortly. Because it's an urban because the best records of it and the best history of it is urban-centric, it tends to be a Catholic-heavy response. So what you see in a lot of the cities is the Catholic parishes taking upon themselves the needed work to bury bodies and to bring aid moving to homes. There's not, at least from what I've read, there's very little mention of what happens in the rural areas. And this becomes problematic for lots of reasons. Number one, it's hard to know how it spreads in those areas just because there isn't a lot of reporting going on that people have tapped into. Now, are there newspapers? Yes. If an historian was very interested in the rural countryside, they could go find it, but that's typically not what they're doing. So I think for the Protestants themselves, who their real power comes in these other areas, they just don't show up in the historical record as often. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. We do know that the church had taken on reform very, very seriously by the 1890s. And so you would expect that it would have an active role to play. And I have to be honest with you, from the religious history stuff that I've done, which is usually my bailiwick, which is another frustrating thing, in all of the religious work I've done, talk about poverty, talk about industrialization, no talk about. Well, some talk about cholera, typhoid, where the church had gone in to deal with issues. But when it comes to the influenza pandemic, there's just very little mention of Protestant involvement. And I want to say, I don't think that's because they weren't involved, but I think it was probably off camera for what we've got at this point. So I'm sorry, Ned, that's a fabulous question. I don't have a great answer for it.
More work to be done.
More work to be
So
done.
if someone out there wants to get into that for a thesis, go for it. This one just came in off the YouTube, and excuse me. Did many state or local governments implement rules and restrictions to combat the 1918 flu like today's measures? Telling people to stay at home, limiting gatherings. If so, this is how did people respond? So that's a question from Kat, coming in from the YouTube. Thank you, Kat.
Kat, great question. And I'm glad you asked it because we really shouldn't talk about this without bringing up the word mask at some point in our conversation. So that was my fault. And I had it in there, but I just wasn't onto it. But yeah, there actually, part of the problem with response came that no one knew what it was. This is another little interesting tidbit. They didn't discover viruses until 1933 actually. So they didn't know there was a thing as a virus. They thought it was a bacterium, but then that didn't prove to be right. They thought it was pneumococcal, that didn't prove to be right, so they couldn't find it. So they didn't know how to respond. So actually a lot of localities thought that it was bad air, so they encouraged everyone to go outside into large groups. Not a great suggestion for the time. But they did discover, at least as they got into it, they did finally, I have to mention one funny thing about that. So you can, if someone ever asks you, you can say this, which is kind of fun. How were viruses discovered? The sneeze of a ferret. I'm not kidding you, this is actually legitimate, right? The story is, I won't tell the whole thing, but they were trying to figure out why, if they filtered out bacteria, and so they would take sputum, someone that was sick would cough up phlegm, they would take the phlegm and they would strain the bacteria out, and what was left was considered strained sputum, and then people would ingest this, and I didn't do this, obviously, but you could do this if you wanted to. But they couldn't get the symptoms again. So one doctor finally was able to get it into a ferret. The ferret sneezed on him, that's what they're trying to get it to, and he got the flu.
Interesting.
And when that happened, they realized they knew what a virus was.
Wow.
So,
You ferret owners out there, what have we been saying all these years?
you're gonna get the flu. So if that's how we discovered the flu in the 1930s, how were you going to know that in 1918?
Right.
So the response to it was very asymmetrical. There were states and cities that did tons of things. They tried to quarantine because they knew that it happened through populations, but then they wanted people outside. They did eventually try masks. The city that tried it the most was San Francisco. Now here's the crazy part about that. San Francisco was the only city, I believe, to actually enforce mask wearing in the fall of 1918. In fact, at one point, they were doing mask raids. So they would go, where they would go is to hotel lobbies, because that's where people would go to smoke. And so the police would go, and in one day, on a single day, they arrested 400 smokers from all of the hotels in San Francisco because they had their masks hanging around their ear while they were smoking cigarettes. So they enforced it by law, but here's the crazy part. The death rate in the country was 0.6%. In San Francisco, it was 0.7%.
Interesting.
So even though they were the most strict, now they couldn't be entirely strict because the masks were on and off and on and off. It was never really consistent. So I'm not saying masks don't work. But what a lot of San Franciscans were frustrated about was, here you're making us wear masks and we're dying at faster rates in other towns. In fact, it got so bad that in the spring of 1918, this happened in December, of 1918, someone actually planted a bomb at the head of the chief medical servant for San Francisco, Chief of Medicine's office.
There's nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new. They sent a package full of explosives, glass, and steel, and it never went off.
Right.
So if you think you're mad about masks where people are today,
Yeah.
not quite that mad.
We'll take one here, sir.
You said it just like faded away. Are there any particular theories or thoughts as to why it just all of a sudden disappeared?
I'm going to scare you now.
Why did it just fade away?
Oh,
was the
sorry.
question, yeah.
I'm going to scare you now. We don't know. They don't know what flu it was. What actually happened was the deaths were happening so quickly in Alaska that they were burying them in the frost. Several years ago, a doctor, and I can't think of his name, got the great idea of let's go dig up some bodies because it's been in the frost. They did, and they found out, sadly, and I don't know how that means, sadly, they didn't bury them deep enough. So actually, the frost came and went, and so it's largely deteriorated, so they don't know. So they assume it was an H1N1 is the best they've had, which leaves a couple questions. Why was it so virulent? And here's, oh, by the way, here's another key factor about this, and what's so scary probably about the 1918 flu, is a lot of the people it killed and why it killed the young is because the flu didn't actually kill them. The body reacted so quickly and so aggressively to the depth of the flu that the body actually killed itself. And why the young died in such numbers was their immune system was so potent that when it saw the flu, it basically unleashed every weapon it had. And you know about cytokines, and you're familiar at all with the body's defenses. It has very deadly defenses. It unleashed almost all of them. And when they would cut open the lungs of those that died, they found the alveoli had basically disintegrated into sponge. And the lungs were full of blood, not because the virus had done it. The body had done it. It had gotten so aggressive with the attack. So again, here's the scary part, Brendan. What flu does that? We don't know. It's an H something N something, maybe an H1N1, derivative, but again, they haven't gotten their hands on the exact one yet, so they're not exactly sure which one. So the way that it killed, the speed at which it killed is all very frightening, and sadly we don't have a ton of answers for it.
But it does move on. I read on the Wikipedia article, it's extended my knowledge on this, like the rest of you, I'm sure. But it would come to a place for a month,
Yeah.
and basically then move on.
Right.
So the nature of viruses is they do their thing, and then
Right.
so
And then they mutate.
they mutate.
Which becomes the problem. So
Right.
if you're looking at something now, you're looking at a mutant, you're not looking at the original strain.
Right.
So what you find with coronavirus similar to flu is every time it mutates, it actually weakens.
Right.
So what you can guess is that it hit in such a fury, it was multiplying and replicating so quickly that it weakened itself out in a matter of weeks. And here's another interesting part to that, by the way. China, that had the flu probably in previous year, 1917, much more mild cases by the time it came back around 1918. Similarly, by the way, states that had gotten the first wave very strong in cities did not get the wave strong in the second. So they had built up enough of immunity at that time that the next strain wasn't as deadly to it.
Yeah. Okay, we have another one from YouTube, and I'll read it. I think I understand.
I hope you do.
So there's this approach to this pandemic, which is individual versus corporate approach. I think what that person means, kind of the aggregate versus the personal responsibility. Does this have anything to do with, or how does this play into, I guess, the high rate of infection that we have compared to other nations? Is that a clue to our high rate of infections compared to other nations?
Bummer. Now I got to be a medical expert on
Just say what you, I mean,
yeah.
or even based on the Spanish flu. I mean,
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I know. Let's take an interesting example though, and that would be Italy, where a lot of us first sort of heard about it happening. An extremely communal culture ends up creating a spread much faster, and getting Italians to stop spending time with their parents. That's impossible. You don't do that. I have a friend from Uganda, and he said what's interesting about Americans is that at a certain age, the parents and the child separate and become a distance relationship. Where in Uganda, you actually center your family around the parents and the grandparents. They are the center of the family. So in that communal aspect, you give up your identity and your freedom for the sake of your larger family unit. Now, I don't know why American infections are higher, but in countries where the family units ended up tying closer, the coronavirus spread much more quickly. Because, of course, you were spending a lot of time together in close quarters. So that's related, but I'd have to look deeper into why the US faced higher infection rates because of that.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Let's go back to the World War I thing. This was going to be my question. So we have people during World War I obsessed with the war effort, and as a result, the influenza just kind of subservient to that. So, and I guess I'm wondering, like, how, without mass media of any kind really before, newspapers, could they get a country so wrapped up,
Right.
and so ramped up about the effort of that being more concerning to them,
Right.
as a culture versus
Right.
people are dying next door.
Right. That is a great question, and that's probably, for me, the $64 million question, or I guess modern money, $64 billion question, maybe.
Yeah.
Made more sense back in the 1990s, yes. Yeah, and why is that? I think for that day and age, we can say a couple things. One, it was after the nationalization of the media. I mean, for the first time by the 1880s and 1890s, William Hearst and Horace Greeley, you've got the push for the first time of national story making. So the Yellow Press that launched the war in Cuba, the Spanish-American War in 1898, that was launched because the media, for the first time, got a hold of stories for the sake of selling papers and threw that out onto the streets, where people whipped into a frenzy. And this is what Mark Twain says: why are we going to war in Cuba? Why is that our business? He was saying things then that we'll say in Vietnam in 1960s. But the reason is because the newspapers were able to ramp up the public. And remember that Woodrow Wilson, and by the way, here's another interesting part of that story, Tom, that's worth telling, is that Woodrow Wilson, in order to launch World War I, had probably launched the greatest propaganda campaign up until Hitler and Lenin's campaigns in Russia and Germany later in the century, where he actually paid people to go out and write stories and control stories so they get the public online. Woodrow Wilson's expansion of political power through the press is unlike anything we've seen in the modern era. And the media went along with it for patriotic purposes. We could probably say there's lots of reasons why. Typically, the answer is what the Germans did in Northern Europe, as World War I was beginning, created such a stir that the world's nations got upset about it. And Woodrow Wilson spent the next 2 or 3 years trying to convince the American public. And he did so by controlling the American media through a propaganda machine that was extremely well funded and very effective. So by the time 1918 happens, he's been doing that for several years.
Oh, so there were ways to do that. Here in the room? Oh, sorry. Yes.
So your studies of the Spanish flu, what are your conclusions to it having a catalyst that then set the stage for the Roaring '20s
Right.
and Prohibition? What was the societal reaction to such depression in a short period of time, and then jump from that to the other side of the pendulum to the Roaring '20s?
Yeah.
So the question goes from Spanish flu's impact upon the Roaring '20s, Great Depression. Probably throw the Dust Bowl in there.
Why not? Why not? Bring it all.
Bring it all.
Yeah. I mean, that's it.
Just take the next decade.
Yeah.
I'm trying to correlate that
Yeah.
to what we're experiencing today,
Sure.
and it's different, but it's similar.
Yeah.
Okay.
And are we going to see
Yeah.
another reaction?
Yeah.
And we'll go
Should
back
we
to the
subscribe
20s.
to that?
We'll jump back in his lane and go
We'll
to
go
the
back
20s.
to 20s, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really great question, because what comes out of the 1920s is, for the first time, a culture that you would define as individualistic. That's crazy, because typically cultures are value systems that force the individual, right, to give something up for the sake of that. And that's why, if you look at Europe's approach to America in the 1920s, they were extremely critical of the over-individualization of American society, which became this entertainment culture we all live in now. The great question is, why did that erupt right on the heels of something like this? And I think what Crosby is driving at is the pandemic came at a singular moment. If you were to bring the pandemic back to 1890, you wouldn't have gotten the same result you got in 1918. And I think probably if we were, I'm gonna put your question into the broader narrative of the 1920s. World War I is typically blamed for the fact that it killed the reformist spirit in America, that all the good we do didn't solve anything. It just killed lots and lots of people. Woodrow Wilson, for example, goes to war under the 14 points, where he believes he can actually save Europe from its problems. When the Paris Peace Treaty actually happens, Woodrow Wilson sidelined through that entire process. And when that is over, all but one of Wilson's points actually succeeds. My point I'm driving at is this. the effort, and this is possible, so Kevin, I'm gonna have to think about this more deeply with the pandemic. The effort to re-identify the American people was such a smashing failure by 1919 and 1920 that the youth culture actually reacted in the opposite direction to create what we call now the Roaring Twenties. That's not the lost generation stuff, which I'm sure you've heard about. The idea that the ideological youth that went off to fight the war, what if one soldier came back? All I did was go to the war to watch other people die. I mean, there was nothing in it that they came back and said this was worth the fight. As much as Wilson tried to convince everyone that it was, and I think they still believed it in 1918, I think by 1919 it's gone. What I can't say is whether the pandemic had a similar reaction in the American people. I'm going to guess that it did, but I don't have an answer for you. That's a really great question. Not that your all questions weren't really great.
That's good.
I have to rethink that now.
We can take a few more if anybody online out there has one, wants to put it on YouTube or text me from your email. And in the room here, we have one more in the room. Don't be bashful. In the back, sir.
I'm gonna be a little provocative here.
Great.
I find it interesting that we tend to separate the terms patriotic and nationalistic as a rule, but in America we tend to define ourselves very proudly as patriotic. But yet at the same time, we're very focused on the individual, not the collective. So where does that dissonance happen, and how does that impact? How did that impact the 2018? The 1918
Right.
flu, where and the aftermath, where there's this corporate patriotism, but this rejection of the corporate for the individual.
All right.
So maybe restate that.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, restate that. I'm too excited.
Well, I guess, what was the dissonance then between individual, or like corporate patriotism and individual rejection of
Or individualism,
ideals?
that's part of our culture, yeah.
Wait, is that close?
I think he has.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think if I can say the issue,
Yeah.
the issue is you've got this idea of patriotism or nationalism, and this is rife in 1918. In fact, I think when you read all of the news articles and what commentators are saying, that's what just is pouring onto the page, right? They're comparing any influenza you have to, in fact, a war bond, right? This is how it all happens. So the question is, in a country where we're patriotic about an ideal that's individualistic, right? How does that actually work? And that's a great question. This was my last lecture about American exceptionalism, so I don't want to go back and revive all that. But there's something very interesting. And so two things. Sorry, my mind's racing. Two things. One, patriotism and nationalism are not the same thing. Nationalism is a virulent form of patriotism. We actually tried nationalism in this country. It was called the KKK, and it was a disaster. It was a nationalistic enterprise to identify a people by a culture and a race, similar to what you see in Europe in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. The country, while it succeeded, it failed miserably, thankfully. But the idea of connecting America's patriotism to individualism is the fact that what the country was about, and this was a crazy transformation of Americans' political identity after the Civil War, that what America is about as its patriotic duty is saving people from tyranny. This is a bizarre national identity. But if you look at here, I'll give it to you in a principle that shocks you when you study American war making from the Spanish-American War up to World War II. America believed, and its people did, that it fought war to save its enemies. The point of the war is to save the enemy. So they asked bomber pilots in 1942 why they were dying over Germany, and the psychologist was asking them as they were not making it, but they were still going up, why are you doing it? And the answer was, well, somebody has to save the Germans from the tyrants. You're bombing German civilians to save them from Germany's tyrant. There's something in the American consciousness that, and I think this has largely been lost since Vietnam, which I think was the great break of faith in this model, that somehow and you'll see this in a lot of the commentary about 1918, you're going to the war to save the world from tyranny. That really what you're doing under a constitutional arrangement in your mind is you're rallying your entire people and dying if need be to save other individuals from a tyranny over their freedom. Now, that's a really hard thing to hold together, which is why Vietnam is the disaster I think that it really was. I think World War II, the culture sort of held on to that as best they could, but when the world got complicated during the Cold War, that narrative just became almost impossible to maintain. I am lightly touching on something that's a huge topic to unpack, so I'm sorry I'm not really doing justice to your question, but I think there's a lot to unpack in how the American culture redefined national identity from the 1890s roughly to World War II that now has been lost. Yeah, sorry, that's exciting.
Very exciting, good stuff. Well, unless we have one more in the room, we're going to shut this down. And as we normally do, take your time, maybe use your mask on the way out. We can hang out down near the outside and finish off some of the food and coffee if it's still there, and chit chat. Maybe meet someone you didn't come in with. But you guys online too, thank you for joining us. And if you're watching this post forum, please know you can find out more about the Row House. It's really easy, therowhouse.org. Just go there and become a member. If you become a member, you can sustain our mission. You can come to our live events for free, bring a friend, come to our 10th on the 10th events. And if you're out there in some other place besides Lancaster, in the great beyond, we do send a journal out twice a year, and we try to send, sometimes little gifts and thanks and whatever, just try to really appreciate your membership. Keeps us going, so love to have you engaged. But thank you for RSVPing and engaging that way. We have your email now, so you'll get our emails and you're welcome to enjoy them or unsubscribe, it's up to you. But we'd love to keep you in the fold. But let's hear it again for Dan Spanjer tonight.
Yeah.
Create more. Any good history should create more questions than answers.